Hello, welcome everyone. Delighted that you could join us today for the panel discussion, Gertrude Stein, How Do You Mean? My name is Am Johal. I'm director of SFU's Van City Office of Community Engagement. We've been doing free public events here since 2010. Wonderful to be partnering with Turning Point Ensemble. And this event, of course, precedes the 7:30 performance with TPE doing Songs of War. I have seen music on the text of Gertrude Stein. That's a ticketed event, and we'll be downstairs in the Fay Miltumong Theater at 7:30. I'm going to just get things started. Our moderator this evening is Betsy Warland. She's got 12 books of poetry, creative nonfiction, and lyric prose. Among the leading lyric prose writers in Canada, her collection of essays on writing, breathing the page, reading the act of writing in 2010 became a bestseller. She also designed and directed the Writers' Studio at SFU from 2001 to 2012. As the Writers' Studio director, she initiated the annual two-day Downtown East Side Writers' Jamboree at the Carnegie Center, 2008 to 2012, spawned the ongoing highly successful Thursdays Writing Collective. She founded and continues to mentor in the 6-month Vancouver Manuscript Intensive Program, and she's been a professional creative writing teacher and manuscript consultant for the past 30 years. So please join me in welcoming Betsy Warland.
Thank you. Come on down. And I just want to acknowledge territory here and the original people of this land, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Yeah, very grateful. I'm delighted to be here. I'm glad you've been coming for this pre-concert event, which is a new 1 hour, a little bit over 1 hour event that they're just trying out at this point, and I'm really delighted that we're the ones that get to do this. And when I was thinking about this, it's just a nice having this kind of event before a concert or a performance, because it moves us from our kind of daily concerns and preoccupations and weariness sometimes to starting to cross over the threshold to this amazing event, concert that we're going to hear in a couple of hours. So bravo for this new format, yeah, and the people that decided that. What else do I need to mention here? We only have just about an hour and 20 minutes, so we're going to really stay on time, and I'll be going to talk about that more in just a second. I probably should indicate my connection to this event, and I'm a queer experimental author, and Stein has been one of my searchlights formally and topically. And a couple of examples around that is my book, Open is Broken, in 1984, included the first erotic lesbian love poems in Canada in concert with Daphne Narlat's Touch to My Tongue. And to my knowledge, there's never been, that was the first publication, it's 2 books, where there are erotic lesbian love poems. And to my knowledge, there has not been any since. So that's how these kinds of alternate ways, which Stein was brilliant at, how much they matter and speak to areas that we really need to hear more of and have more engagement with. Anything else to say there? Also, just because silence and space and pacing and are as kinds of meaning also relates to Stein in my own work, and happily, I had one of my books turned into a street opera by Lord Burritt in 2022 that was launched, and then also another one, several song cycles with the composer Betsy Warland have also been connected with my books. I think of my writing very much like a composer. If I'd been somebody else but a writer, I would have probably been a composer. And the importance of silence and pacing and waiting. So now I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing our four speakers tonight, and I'm really looking forward to this. Each will reflect on their thinking and work and how it resonates with Stein and Goebbels' remarkable piece, Song of Wars I've Seen. I should mention that Stein lived through both World War I and II in France, and she also wrote several librettos for the American composer Virgil Thomson. So, ready to go? We're going to hear from Adam Frank first.
Thanks, Betsy, and thanks to Jeremy Brinkman for inviting me to participate in today's panel. Again, to Betsy for serving as our fearless leader today, and to Owen Underhill and the Turning Point Ensemble for preparing an extraordinary program of music for us tonight. Can you hear me? Yes. So the first time, as far as I can remember, that I actually read Gertrude Stein was in an English class that I took in the late 1980s. It was an Introduction to Feminist Theory course, and it was on the problem of women's writing. And I really enjoyed the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which is what we read in that class. It's wry, understated Californian narrator who refuses to be impressed by anything. It's wit and humor and deflationary meanness. It's insider access to the glamorous early 20th century Paris art scene. And it's really wonderful modernist device of Stein's writing in the voice of her lover. I also appreciated the snippy takedowns of macho writers like Ernest Hemingway and Ezra Pound. But what I think I liked best was the speed and rhythm of Stein's prose, the way it kept pace with thinking, when one memory or perception gives rise to another, and then another, and then another. Stein called this writing in a continuous present, which I experienced viscerally. The experience was mostly like letting me breathe in some way. So I read more, Lectures in America, and Tender Buttons, and Three Lives, and eventually her long 1,000-page novel, The Making of Americans, on my own post-university graduation 6-month visit to Paris, where I was trying to live out some Steinian expatriate fantasy. In other words, the autobiography was my gateway drug, and I still recommend it to people who want to know where to start with Stein. Her writing made me wonder, where did it come from? What is she up to? What kinds of sense can I possibly make of this writing? And how did a queer Jewish woman writer manage to get so damn successful and famous in the 1930s? So I've since discovered through many years of reading and thinking that Stein's writing is always trying to do something, to solve a problem or investigate an issue. It has epistemic value as well as aesthetic value. Her verbal portraits of friends and acquaintances, for example, aim to capture what she calls the rhythm of anybody's personality, what lets us recognize someone almost immediately, like in the periphery of your vision, from their walking style or their gestures, their characteristic intonations or other bodily movements. Stein's portrait method, as she explains it in her lecture Portraits and Repetition, involves paying attention to her own feeling as a gauge or an index. And here's a quote: "I must find out what is moving inside them that makes them them. And I must find out how I, by the thing moving excitedly inside in me, can make a portrait of them." Stein's techniques of repetition, or what she really called insistence, take into account an emotional circuit as part of the method. Her writing is fundamentally reflexive and drags the reader into the process of composing a portrait and then making sense of the experience. This is what William James, one of her teachers, called radical empiricism, a commitment to bringing perceptual and bodily experience into awareness as part of knowledge practices. So Jeremy asked the panelists what inspires and interests you in Gertrude Stein's work and life, and also what vexes you. So for me, with Stein, what vexes also inspires, what can I say? And I came to find especially her plays quite vexing a number of years ago. She began writing plays just before the First World War and wrote quite a few of them in Mallorca, where she went with Alice Toklas in 1915 to escape the Zeppelin air raids and coal shortages in Paris. According to Richard Bridgman, quote, quote, "The impact of the war on Gertrude Stein's writing was profound. It was in this period that her prose began to absorb heard speech continuously or seriously." And he goes on to suggest that reading Stein in this period is rather like listening to an interminable tape recording made secretly in a household. So sound recording turns out to be an apt medium for interpreting these plays, which motivated my Radio Free Stein project, if you can bring up the website, that stages what I call the parlor plays in collaboration with a handful of composers and sound artists using the idea of radio theater as a guide. Our interpretations of these plays are available as streaming audio on this website. You can it's a kind of elaborate website that has a number of things going on in it. Whoops, that's not what I want. And you can kind of take a little tour of it at your leisure. And here are the plays that why is that happening? There's a number of plays that we've this is the one I'm going to play something for you. We have, there are video excerpts on the website as well from performances that we've done in Vancouver and also a space in New York City. And I'm just going to ask for the tech person to play the last act of For the Country Entirely, a play in letters. The musical setting is by Dorothy Chang, and this will just give you a little sense of the project, brief sense.
Act 5, Scene 1.
This is the last time we will use seasoning.
You mean you like it better cold?
No, don't be foolish.
Dear sir, is there much wisdom in searching for asphodels?
Not if you already know what they are.
We do know now.
Then there is no use in trying to accustom yourself to their beauty.
But we don't find it beautiful.
I too have failed to find beauty in them.
This is not surprising, as they do not grow prettily.
They were a great disappointment to us. Scene 2. We all are able to see I don't care a bit about Lena. We are all able to say I don't care a bit about Lena.
Dear Mrs. Landor, how can you cease to be troubled about the rest of the winter? How can you cease to be troubled about the rest of the summer and the beginning of the winter?
Dear sir, every evening the snow falls.
Red.
Yes, and so do the asphodels.
Asphodel isn't red. I know it looks so.
Dear friend, can you give me any pleasure?
Yesterday afternoon was a holiday.
You mean a festival?
I mean a day of the country.
Do you mean that you understand the country?
No, indeed.
Scene 3.
Scene 3.
Dear friends, have patience.
Scene 4.
This has ended very well.
You mean meeting one another?
Yes, and asking us to remain here.
You mean that a great many people were troubled?
Not a great many people.
Some are very happy.
So are others.
We all have wishes.
Expressed wishes.
Dear sir, will you come again and eat ham?
Not in this country.
Fish.
Not in this country.
So there's much to say and no time to say it, but I will just mention that asphodels are the favorite food of the dead in Greek myth, the flower of Hades planted around graves. So one way of thinking about this play is in terms of its rejection of any discourse that glorifies death in battle in service of the nation, focusing instead on the inability of a group of friends huddled together to understand hellish events taking place far away in a genre that I think Stein wrote in quite a lot, distressed comedy. So do our contemporary experiences make Stein's wartime writing relevant once again? You may have a chance to answer this question when listening to Heiner Goebbels' piece, which uses excerpts from one of her last books, Wars I Have Seen, observations about daily life during World War II in unsentimental yet highly personal, insistent prose. To me, it works as an antidote to panic or polemical propaganda, something more grounded or realistic. A return to the basic question, how do you mean? In the face of so many forces in and around us that seek to evacuate meaning. Thanks.
Well, a Steinish thing happened here. I'm going to now read Adam's bio. And I think I'll do that for the rest of the event. Adam is a professor in the Department of English at the University of British Columbia. His research and teaching areas include affect theory and poetics, American literature and culture. He's the author of Transferential Poetics. Where did I lose that line? From Poe to Warhol. It's quite a stretch. 2015. He co-authored with Elizabeth Wilson a Sylvian Thompson Handbook, 2020, and Adam has produced several full-length collaborative sound recordings, including Overpass, a melodrama. I love that title. That was 2007, and Some Mad Scientists, 2010. His new book, Radio Free Stein, you want to hold it up? Beautiful, eh? Gertrude Stein's Parlor Plays has just been published. So, carrying on like Stein, I'm going to just invite our next guest here tonight, Rachel Kiyo Iwaasa, and then I'll give you her bio later.
Gertrude Stein has been called the most famous author you've never read. We find ourselves today, however, in the company of scholars and artists who have indeed read her and responded thoughtfully, creatively, and at length. I, on the other hand, would be more accurately described as a Stein enthusiast. So in contrast to my learned colleagues, I worry that in my talk today there might be no there, but nevertheless, here we go, just like that. I first fell in love with Stein as an aphorist, and despite her protestation that remarks are not literature, she belongs in the line of great queer aphorists like Oscar Wilde, Walt Whitman, Andy Warhol, and Mary Oliver. Stein has never been accused of being readable, but she is eminently quotable and much quoted. So I love the Gertrude Stein who wrote, commas, hold your coat for you, and I am I because my little dog knows me, which is especially funny when you consider that Gertrude and Alice lived with big dogs. Stein's best known aphorism, a rose is a rose is a rose, is arguably the most quoted line of modernist literature, which when you consider that a rose and eros are near homonyms, means that Stein put the phrase love is love is love on everybody's lips decades before it became the rallying cry for marriage equality. I love Stein for the genius she put in her life. I love butch lesbians, and you have to admire the chutzpah of an avant-garde artist who managed to make her Jewish butch lesbian self into a celebrity. How many 20th century Jewish butch lesbian celebrities can you name from those first decades? The closest contemporary I can think of, photographer Claude Cahun, toiled in obscurity and is only getting her due now. And I love Stein as the art collector and salon host. Stein's been described as a narcissist, but she really was an important supporter of other people's work in concrete and tangible ways, providing a place where like minds could meet and discover each other, but especially by buying their work and literally putting food in their mouths. Gertrude and Alice's walls were hung with cubists and fauvists and impressionists, so that Hemingway described their Paris apartment as comparable to one of the best rooms in the finest museum. So I'll admit that when Jeremy Berkman told me, I'll admit that until Jeremy Berkman told me about it, I was completely ignorant that Gertrude Stein has been accused of being a Jewish lesbian Nazi, because she and Alice B. Toklas, against all odds, somehow managed not to be killed in Nazi-occupied Vichy France. Now, I'm thankful to Adam Frank for pointing me to the website about this controversy on jacket2.com, and you can find it easily yourself. Just do a web search for Stein and Vichy and dossier, and I really recommend it because it's the most interesting internet rabbit hole I've gone down. I'll summarize it with a few of my own additions. to the charge that Stein was a collaborator because she didn't leave France but didn't die. Where were Gertrude and Alice to go? To the US, where psychiatric incarceration of lesbians was commonplace through to the 1970s, as it was in the UK and also here in Canada? And what would be being said of them today if, like so many desperate European Jews, they'd fled for their lives to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv? Instead, they fled to the French countryside, where their local doctor told them, "Everybody knows you here, everybody likes you, and we'd all help you in every way. Why risk yourself among strangers?" Indeed, 3/4 of the French Jewish population survived in this same way with the help of friends and neighbors who quietly resisted the German orders. Stein, as her characteristic enfant terrible, once made a flippant remark in a newspaper interview that Hitler deserved the Nobel Peace Prize. And this has been escalated into a false claim that she had in fact actually nominated him. But this is kind of like accusing Mel Brooks of crafting a tribute to Hitler when he made The Producers. Stein is condemned for having translated the speeches of the head of the Vichy administration, Maréchal Pétain, into English. But, as it's been pointed out, these are actually non-translations. They read like a pre-digital Google Translate. These Stein's translations resist meaning with every word. Gertrude and Alice are considered suspect because, with the help of friends, they managed to hide their astounding art collection from the Nazis when the property of their Jewish compatriots was all seized. But I have to point out that after Gertrude died and Alice went back to the country for a bit, she returned to find their Paris apartment empty. Gertrude's family of origin had taken literally everything of value, leaving Alice destitute, with no legal recourse and no rights. So Gertrude and Alice managed to save the paintings from the Nazis, but they couldn't save them from Gertrude's family. Stein wrote that reading Shakespeare during World War II, it felt like she was reading just what she was seeing all around her. And in parallel, I find Stein's words from 80 years ago feel chillingly current, like a missive that could have been written tomorrow. 3 years before World War II, Stein wrote in a letter to a friend, "Disguise it to yourself as you will. The majority does want a dictator. It's natural that a majority, if it's come to be made up of enormous numbers, do. A big mass likes to be shoved as a whole because it feels it moves, and they cannot possibly feel that they move themselves as little masses can. There you are. Like it or not, there we are." So in November 2024, as we find ourselves awash in propaganda among rising tides of anti-Semitism and gender panic, I'm grateful to Turning Point for making me reread Stein, to think about Gertrude and Alice and about survival in desperate times. I'm grateful that Gertrude and Alice survived in plain sight. And I don't know about you, but I'm ready to move to the country.
Now about Rachel. Quote from the George Strait, "Keyboard virtuoso, an avant-garde muse." Rachel is one of Canada's foremost contemporary music pianists, known for fearless performative risks. Rachel's art practice explodes expectations of what's possible at the piano, flowering in liminal collision between artistic genres. She's worked with composers Hildegard Westerkamp, Rodney Sharman, Jocelyn Morlock, Chris Dirksen, Leslie Ueda, Nicole Lisée, and artist S.D. Holman, film director, and Nettie Wild, playwright, and David Bloom. Choreographers Jennifer Mescal, Idan Cohen, and Tara Shean Fredenberg, and multimedia provocateur Paul Wong. Quite a list, eh? You've been really busy. Rachel's recordings are released on Red Shift Records and Earsay Music. Rachel was co-founder of the Queer Arts Festival in Vancouver, which I remember very well. When did it start? How long ago was that?
The festival,
Begin?
The first exhibition was way back in 1989, actually. But the festival as a whole started in 2006.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. Next. Who do we have next? Peter, do you want to come up? All right. This is fun, eh?
Thank you. And a big thank you to Turning Point, to SFU for putting this together. I'm thrilled to be part of this panel. I've been a fan of Stein's writing for about 40 years, and I'm much more comfortable expressing myself in music than in words, but here we go. There's much to say. Because we have 7 minutes, I will try to stay as conscious as possible about time, and I want to talk about Stein's concept of the continuous present and her use of syntax and the way it plays with time and the impact it's had on me as a composer. As a composer, I try to stay as conscious as possible about how my music feels in the time that it's played, which is very, very different from the time I experience when I'm composing. In the mid-1970s, reading Stein brought my attention to the experience of passing in time more than any other of the studies I was doing. And not by what she said, but by how she said it. Her use of what she called the continuous present or the continuous now appeared to me about the same time that I was developing an interest in Eastern philosophy, reading about and experiencing Joyce's concept of the epiphany, and taking a course studying Heidegger's concept of Dasein. I can't remember what drew me to Stein's writing. It was never has been a part of my formal studies. But I remember being completely enthralled by these two collections, which I bought in the 70s, which I've come back to many times, although I also now own almost her complete works and still working through them. To me, many of Stein's writings were literally music to my ears. I was completely taken by her rhythms, her syntactical structures, her formal surprises, and most of all by her sense of play and sense of timing. Along the way, I was compelled to search for other authors who had similar characteristics and came across the writings of such writers as Alain Robbe-Grillet, Jamaica Kincaid, David Markson, and especially the German writer Thomas Bernhard. Still, I always return to Stein for inspiration, and she never fails to deliver. I think Stein really needs to be read out loud. It is the only way that she can be experienced as the sculptor of time that I think she is. Like a good sculptor, the sense of time she plays with is both on the micro and macro levels, moment to moment, but over larger spans of time. The epitome of this idea is exemplified in her gargantuan, The Making of Americans, where a small story plays out over a very long novel, while demanding attention be paid at every moment. I have set a number of Stein's texts over the years, including for a 1995 full-evening instrumental theater piece based on her If I Told Him, a completed portrait of Picasso, and a 1998 chamber orchestra called Asks Alice, which is 2 minutes long, but has the instruction to repeat that 2 minutes 8 to 13 times exactly. More than setting her texts, Stein's writings have had a profound influence on my compositional style, on what I might call, to paraphrase Stein, my bottom nature as a composer. That influence is rooted in her treatment of time and in the continuous present I experience when reading much of her work. In his 1949 lecture on Nothing, John Cage, another composer deeply influenced by Stein, posited the idea of a musical composition as structured time, a container of proportions into which one could pour ideas. I think this concept could be applied to some of Stein's writings. Years ago, I actually tried out this concept in a percussion piece where, instead of setting her libretti, I mapped her story at the phrasal level to create musical material. I applied her phrasal repetitions, fragmentations, expansions, and contractions, and followed the form of her story through my piece, working at both micro and macro levels. At one point, the percussionist speaks Stein's text from the story before returning to the musical material. Those are the only actual words that appear in that piece. Stein's goal, especially in earlier years, was to be a literary cubist. Cubism, of course, is a visual arts form defined by abstraction, fragmentation, multiple perspectives. Her use of repetition, varied repetition, and fragmented figures all can be connected to visual cubism, but these ideas play out differently in a time-based art. I have two examples from my piece, Reflections on the Atomic Bomb, which is being played tonight, a few floors down from here, that I think shows Stein's influence on me at that time. The first one features a musical phrase which manifests itself cubist style in fragments. A complete iteration of the phrase is heard, followed by multiple fragments of that phrase, each fragment having a different starting and ending point within the phrase, and all of them separated by silences. The second example uses varied repetition in a call and response style. Normally in call and response, the response mimics the call exactly. In this excerpt, neither call nor response is ever the same, but instead variants on the same basic idea. I really do think that piece is from 1988, but I do think those ideas came from reading Stein, although there's 2 minutes of Stein that are read at a wonderful text she wrote in 1946 that are read at the end of a 25-minute piece. Anyways, we have the two little excerpts I talked about here. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Peter is a composer and a music curator. He has composed works in a large number of genres, from orchestral to chamber music to instrumental theater, electroacoustic, and installations. Peter's compositions are both heady, which we've just experienced, and playful, and profound and humorous, You just heard all that. It's great. Theatrical and multimedia elements have been incorporated in many of his works. The writings of Gertrude Stein have played an important role in his compositions. Peter has been very active in the artistic director of new music ensembles and festivals. He is a professor emeritus at Wilfrid Laurier University and now makes his home in the Gulf Islands on the West Coast. And we know where, Canada. Wow, Renée, we're almost done. This is so much fun. I don't want it to end. Please come on. Renée Sarojini.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? I am honored and grateful to be here, and I want to stay within time and get to a little bit of a reading of poems inspired by Stein, so I'm going to read from my little script. I'm going to be sharing thoughts from the perspective of a writer who sees herself as a craftsperson, working words and language, influenced by Stein, who I see as a maker. Imploding syntax, as has been discussed by our learned panel, juxtaposing grammatical parts as a compositional method. I'll speak briefly about these ideas, and then I'll read a bit, as I said, from 3 poems entitled 3 Character Portraits in Search of Gertrude Stein. These are excerpts from a novel in progress, and the poems themselves first appeared in 2011 in the literary journal Prism International, and I actually fished out a copy, and then we'll read from it. So to begin then, thinking about Gertrude Stein and her work, including Songs of War, and on the work of these fine panelists and the music we'll hear later this evening, I wanted to, as my colleagues have done, first share a small personal story that might resonate. The first time I ever encountered Stein was through Tender Buttons. It was a Vancouver Public Library book. Of course, we know this is a collection of prose poems published in 1914, and I love the symmetry of thinking about 1914 with all its horrors right now. I was living in New Westminster at the time, studying writing, and literally fell off my couch, like just literally fell off, transfixed by what I experienced on the page. I was a student at SFU's The Writer's Studio under the then leadership and direction of Betsy Warland. And so it's actually incredibly moving to be a part of this event. And it was Betsy who directed me to read Stein. I was struggling with finding diction and language that could fully express my own traumatic and racialized past. I won't get into that now, but you can Google me and you'll understand what I mean by trauma. So then, after experiencing this fall off the couch moment, I absolutely remember the moment. And I very soon then started experimenting with different prose styles. And when I did that, I wanted to highlight today some central ideas that have already been mentioned by our learned panel as a craftsperson, as a worker plying the trade. And hopefully that will resonate a bit more with what you hear tonight. So one of the central ideas I've absorbed from Stein's scholarship and Stein herself is language as material. Betsy in the studio really had us think about this. There's a phrase, a famous French philosopher, I won't get into all that now, against description, and encouraging us to think of language as material. I'll dovetail back to that in a moment. 2 side offshoot ideas are lack and abundance, as it relates to otherness, and transgression as expression. Again, thank you, Betsy, for that all those years ago. It's a huge influence on me. So, Stein, the word maker, tension in language, fullness and lack. Stein once stated about her words, and this is just a quick grab from Wikipedia, again, in the interest of time, famous quote, "Claiming nothing, not claiming anything, not a claim in everything, collecting, claiming, all this makes harmony. It even makes a succession." For me, this quote illustrates the tension in language between lack and fullness. Okay, I admit that's originally an Lacanian idea, but I'm not going to go there right now. Ideas are the fullness, I would argue, with Stein, And lack is our inability to fully access the idea when it confronts us on the page. Stein influenced me to think about that tension, how to craft words so that the reader gets to the fullness even as they experience lack. When I read a little bit from my 3 prose poems, Character Portraits in Search of Gertrude Stein, I hope you'll get a little sense in your own body of this dichotomy. So this idea of lack and fullness, I believe, in Stein's work highlights this also accompanying ideas of transgression and relates to otherness in language making. What is on the page? What is not on the page? Irony. Stein, wealthy, privileged, an American in Paris, and then the French countryside, with folks who probably almost certainly were friends with Vichy France, still speaks to me, a poet of color who defines herself, I define myself, not just as tekton, the Greek word employed by the Roman Empire, in a way of derision, right? A textile worker of words, but also that worker embodied in my surname, Saklikar, related as it is to the Parampari Karigars, who are textile workers of Gujarat and Maharashtra. I can't read Stein without being aware of this irony. As a writer, self-perceiving these things, I'm really interested in what she did with language as material. So to recap before I read the poems, I think technically she specifically shrunk the distance between noun and verb. She collapsed pronoun orders, and she did a lot of something that apparently she discussed in great detail with Picasso. She juxtaposed words that she deemed of equal value. And there's so much to say about that. I won't do it. I really hear a lot of this in Peter's work, and I'm really excited to hear what will happen in the concert. Okay, so that's enough of that. Are you ready for some poetry? All right. 3 character portraits in search of Gertrude Stein. I won't read all of them. They look like chunks of text. I'll read fragments. 3 character portraits. We have Vivian, Sally, and Niall. Vivian. The days are drudgery, and the nights are long, and the life is tedious. Breasts are something, and they are full. There is provocation that is not interaction. Breasts are pigeons, and there is cooing. She is walking. So much breathing has not the same effect when she is stationary. So much pouting has not the same effect when she is glossing. That is not the same as her mother workhorsing in other people's houses. So much breathing is her mother, backside upended, skirts bedraggled on the floor. There is the washing and scrubbing. So much breathing is her mother and her father at night, fighting. There must not be so much fighting. There can be the 3 of them. There is her uncle. The unit is not broken. He is not working. He is staring. Her fullness is a fact. Any time is the quarter of all the breathing in their house. Sally, the days are busy and the nights are soothing and the life is full of things. Any time is family time and is half the noise of the neighbors. An argument does not happen. Everyone is happy and serene and round-cheeked, and there are so many things. There comes the father, and he is happy. There cooks the mother. She is happy. The family is sweetmeats and puddings and custard and pasties. So much chattering is not the same purpose when there is that much clutter. So much talking is dusting and drapes. The house is not lonely. She is nightgowns and candy floss and breathless. Homework is not chattering. She is telephone calls and there is cuteness. Her hair is her habit. She is blunt cut or spirals. There does not happen to be a dislike for each other. There can be laughter. She is the center. She is the center. Fast and strong and bouncy. She is bouncing. And then the last character portrait in search of Gertrude Stein, Niall. The days are moneyed and the nights are land and the life is acquiring. There is ancestry. He is voiced and sure, and his teeth are always hunting. Women are useful, seeking, snaring. He will not be snared. So much pushing is also grasping. He is bent on materials. He will inherit. The preserve is that property, and there is not that giving. There is accumulation. There is settler. He is unerring. There cannot be failure. More land is something. This is British Columbia. There can be different ways of doing business. There are costs and benefits. He is restless. He is careful and smiling. He is not forced. He is relaxed. It is all accumulation, and it is relaxing. The town and the land and the province and the river. He is a gilly. He knows the price of things. Thank you.
Renée Sarojini is the author of 5 books, including the award-winning Children of Air India and Listening to the Bees. Her poetry, essays, short fiction have appeared in literary magazines and anthologies, including Exile Editions, Chatelaine, The Capilano Review, and Pulp Literature. In 2015, Turning Point Ensemble premiered the opera Air India Redacted, based on Renée's book. Brahma's Quest is the latest volume of her epic speculative fiction in verse series. So this is second or third?
Brahma's Quest is the second. I'm working on the third.
Yeah, so she's just finished the second, and she's working on the third. Yep. Last thing to say? No, not the things to say. Thought BAP. The heart of this journey bears all patterns, and that's the series. She was poet laureate at the City of Surrey, 2015 to 2018. And she teaches creative writing at Douglas College. Thank you very much, Renée. How much time do we have here? I'm looking. But is it 10 to? Okay. We're going to have a very brief exchange, just because it'd be fun to do, and then ask if anybody has something to respond to or question. We need to wrap it up at, I think it's supposed to be wrapped up by 6:10, because there's another event coming into this theater. So we're going to talk for a little bit, and then we'll wrap it up after we hear from you. So let's get our mics.
Talk show time.
I just, are we on?
Yeah.
Yep. I want to know how it's felt for the 4 of you to be sort of cheek by jowl doing this.
Fantastic.
Really, yes.
Yeah?
Fantastic.
Yeah, yeah.
I can't remember the last time I had so much imposter syndrome.
I have lots of questions for my fellow panelists, but
Lots of questions. Okay. Okay. Well, we'll go to. I've just enjoyed it thoroughly. It
Thank
just
you,
feels.
Betsy.
It feels so rare. Both kind of what we are engaging in terms of our quest, and to just be able. I wanted us to just sort of really listen to each other. That's partly why I decided psychologically to not do the bios until after they've read, because you know what I mean? Like, so
I
often
loved
we
it.
do things in the wrong order, to me, in the Western world. So, yeah. Any comments or questions?
Well, wrong order. I think it's in Four Saints, where in Act 2, Scene 1 follows Scene 2 before a repeat. Like, it's just hilarious. I don't, I'm sure Adam was confronted with those kinds of stage directions all the time.
Yeah, or whatever order means for Stein. It's not what it means when we live our daily lives, So, but at the same time, it feels like there can always be a kind of return to simplicity in some way. I was going to ask Peter a little bit about why you think, Virgil Thomson and other composers tend to use fairly simple harmonics in there when they set Stein. Not all the time, but just I was hearing that in your piece, and I just wanted to know whether you had something to say about that.
Well, it's parlando, like you need to hear the words and clearly, and the best way to do that is to simplify things around it. And yeah, I mean, that's maybe the short answer, and she inspires...
I love that answer.
She inspires, there's a kind of a bluntness about her writing that I think is connected to that.
Well, I have a question that takes us to another place, so I don't know if we wanted to continue this. Okay, we can circle back. So thank you, Rachel, so much for taking us through something that I think has to be talked about and how we talk about it and contextualize it, which is the controversy around Stein. And I just want to kind of put our colleagues on the spot a little, because while you were reading and you referenced Charles Bernstein's dossier, which I've spent quite a bit of time on as well, thank you so much for referencing it. I was watching Adam, and I was watching your facial reaction, and then I turned to him and I quietly said, oh, I guess you're not a fan of a biography that I would actually recommend. I don't think, right? Like, so can we get into that a little? That there is the Charles Bernstein on Jacket 2. I have my own dialectic with Jacket 2. As a racialized writer, I have my own dialectic with Jacket 2 and the whole mid-century American aesthetic there. It is very whiteness. Claudia Rankine has an amazing takedown of it, but that doesn't mean it's wrong or bad, there's so much good information there. But can you talk a bit about how you're a scholar, how would you, if I was a student in your class and I said the following, because this is what I did this morning, I was really curious. I Googled, did Gertrude Stein collaborate with the Nazis in Vichy France? And AI spit out all this interesting stuff. So if I was your student and I asked you that, what might you say?
I would say that she was protected by Bernard Fay, who was a Vichy collaborator, that the question of how she was going to survive in France, which Rachel has so clearly, and I'm really grateful for you for kind of laying it all out, was raised by, what was she going to do? Bernard Fay and she had a long, this is the subject of Barbara Will's study, Unlikely Collaboration, is the relationship between Stein and Fay. So
he was really important to her.
He was a French, professor of American literature and was a huge supporter of Stein, and so she had a lot of, gratitude to him for, and they had a perfectly constructive, relationship. His politics were, not something that I would agree with, to put it mildly. But, I don't necessarily need Stein to be so perfect in any and every way. She was really interesting writer. That's the primary thing that I need for a writer to be. And then she was fiscally conservative. She was kind of this,
She was a lifelong Republican, wasn't she?
Well, Republicans meant something different in the 1930s. They would have called them Democrats then.
But I think you've said something so important. Writers don't need to be perfect. And I'm fascinated by her. I feel she is a huge influence. I think Barbara herself, in a National Institute of the Humanities piece, calls her the den mother of modernism. I think it's a very nuanced and interesting discussion how people can influence us. We don't have to love them. We don't have to agree with them, but they can have a profound reach on how we craft. I don't know whether you wanted to.
Yes. I'm just watching the time here. We're doing okay, but good exchange. Yeah. Other sort of comments in terms of how you experienced hearing each other and actually, fashioning your own presentation also. I'd be curious about that.
You're looking at me. I'm better speaking with music than words. So is that a good short answer? I've been studying music and very busy, and as I've mentioned, literature has been an important part of influence, but I actually haven't, I actually do know, I've read about Stein, I've read it, and of course I do, there's much more I could talk about, but it's the impact of her writing style. What can I say? Like, that's just, it's haunted me deeply. And other things are interesting, and I'll pursue them, and I want to know more. But in the end, like, that's what sticks, and what I'll always come back to. I actually have not, congratulations, I have not finished Making of Americans after many years, but when I get into it, it's like being transported to another planet in the best possible way. So, yeah.
On Ubu Sound, you know, that website that collects a lot of avant-garde sound recordings, there's a fellow named Gregory Lehner, I believe his name is, who has read aloud the entire Making of Americans, and
Tell us again the name of the website.
Ubu, U-B-U, Ubu Sound.
Ubu Web, I think.
Ubu Web, yeah. So anyway, it is interesting to hear the process of transformation, because he's clearly committed to the project of reading aloud this entire thing. But in order to do it, he has to engage with any number of strategies for his own sanity, essentially, including chanting, muttering. You know, he goes through all the different forms of speech. So it's recommended.
Rachel, anything to add?
I found it really interesting just to hear all of these. It's like a kaleidoscope of responses to Stein from all of these very different perspectives. I need to respond a little bit to Renée there in that I feel like, this was my first encounter with Jacket too, but I feel like it's important to point out that to conflate Jews within whiteness is not so simple.
No,
right?
and I don't think I was saying that.
Yeah.
I was saying that Jacket 2, the organization as a writerly source, that for those of us being taught experimental poetics, it's often held up in high regard, and rightly so. But there are other ways of experiencing the different writers and points of view. They've done some very interesting things, like the big dispute between Perloff and Rita Dove on that seminal anthology that Rita Dove did, and then Marjorie Perloff, as Marjorie Perloff will do, kind of took her down, like just all that internecine warfare of academics. It's just really interesting, but totally fair. I also wanted to say, like with Stein, I shared it in my presentation. I literally fell off my couch reading Tender Buttons. It changed my life. And it was Betsy who, in her quiet way, not very didactic, but very firm, I'll never forget it. Like, I remember the moment where we were in the writer's studio when you turned to me and you said, you maybe want to think about transgression as a mode of expression. Have you ever read Gertrude Stein?
Well, it's very touching. I think part of where I'm coming in with this is I've been working on an essay, the difference between narrative and story. And it's been a really good time for me to re-engage with Stein, because I think she was really much more interested in narrative than story. And I'll just throw this out here, but I think that story has become so dominant and it's so corrupted that it's really backing us into a corner. And so, that's one thing I value about Stein, is that she didn't get seduced by story.
Can you say a little bit more about what the difference is between narrative and story?
Well, story is very fashioned, and narrative is you follow it as it surfaces.
It's language as material, which I tried to embody.
That's one way of describing it,
Yeah.
and that and it by its inherent sort of beingness resists the simplification of story. That there's always, it keeps shifting. You see the same thing in a different way 10 minutes later. Like, she was just doing all of that. She was incorporating all of that. And so I think it's really a wonderful time to really consider generally what Stein was doing.
And I think for me, as well as a creator, I wonder what our panelists think, to continue on, to persevere in the face of disapproval or indifference, and forge ahead when you are creating a style. She was 120 years ahead of her time. Maybe you can speak.
Well, it's just funny because, after she published Tender Buttons and I guess Three Lives, which are two early publications, when she was reviewed in the American press, it was usually negatively and rather dismissively. But then when she comes back and she looks at them, she says, well, whatever it is they say, my little sentences have gotten under their skins. Because what they're usually doing is imitating her, and she's right. Her little sentences got under all of our skins, it seems.
Oh, gosh, I love it. I'm just checking our time. Yep. I think it's time, and if we have a bit more time, we can come back. But I would love to hear any kind of just reactions, comments, questions that someone might have. And I think it'd be best if you stood up to make sure we can hear you well. There's some. Good. That's perfect.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm just wondering, to what extent does Gertrude Stein work share some similarity or parallel with the ancient Greek poet Sappho?
We're all looking at each other. Oh, wow. It is a great question. The only thing that immediately comes to mind is, again, not story. Sappho's work, we just have fragments of it, right? And those fragments become, kind of obsessive, and you keep kind of thinking it over and looking at it from this angle and that angle and that angle. And so I think that, for me, would be a connection through not necessarily will or decision, but just circumstance. And I think to some degree that was true for Stein too, even though there was also this intellectual kind of journey she was on. I don't know, anybody have anything else to say about that?
Well, I feel like I've interacted with Stein's work mostly in fragments. Like I mostly come across Stein as quotes by other people, so that Sappho became fragmented by history and ruin, and Stein becomes fragmented kind of by virtue of being so quotable but so unreadable at the same time. And so you get these little bits that get pulled out that you can't. Yeah.
Anybody else up there? I'm sure we have some more questions or comments. Do we have somebody? Others? No? Good.
Hi there, thank you to all of you. I was wondering, Peter, you gave us a bit of a close reading of your piece for tonight that gave us a way in. I was wondering if any of you had a way into the Goebbels that we're going to be hearing. I was wondering if any of the panel had anything to say about the Goebbels to give us a way in for tonight.
My one thing is he has a fantastic website. And that is my way in, because I had not heard of him until I'm on the board of Turning Point, and we were discussing the program. And Peter and I were talking about, the first thing I said to Owen was, wow, a composer with the surname Goebbels with Stein. We should do a panel beforehand. And I was saying, Peter and I were talking about, it is one of the most thoughtful, beautiful websites. And he reflexively comments on his surname and how to contextualize it. And it's a beautiful, I think, lead-in to what he then introduces to his music. So that's my layperson's response.
Well, Adam's actually met him, or he was at a similar conference, but I would say I actually didn't know his music really well, but it's of its time in terms of it's an amazing tour de force. Like the combination of elements is quite astonishing, and inspired by Stein, I guess, pulling together all of these fragments. A spoken word, the performers are all, the untrained theatrically performers are speaking texts as well as playing their instruments and so on. And you end up with this incredible kind of kaleidoscope. I don't know how to describe it, but yeah, sorry.
No, I haven't met him. I almost was at a same conference as he was 10 years ago, which is really not a very close connection at all. But I will say that having just listened to this piece last weekend by looking at the YouTube video that was sent around, it is astonishing how rarely you hear musicians, instrumentalists, that is, voices, like their literal voices. And for him, that's a really important part of this piece, that he's letting the musicians read. And when...
Making.
Exactly. And their idiosyncratic interpretations of the Stein text are what keeps us paying attention.
Okay.
I love how he puts this one person's voice in so many different voices. And so the various musicians' comfort or discomfort, in some cases extreme discomfort, with having their, using their own, with using their voices, their speaking voices as part of their performance, in some ways for me really symbolizes the way Stein has just kind of worked her way into the culture in this almost kind of guerrilla way, despite, again, being notoriously unreadable. I really liked how she talks, he uses a lot of the text where she talks about Shakespeare and about how reading Shakespeare in World War II, the themes, the way his insights and characters felt so current. And Goebbels also has a lot of these kind of musical flashbacks into the Baroque period. So, not directly contemporaneous with Shakespeare, but this whole sense of backwards and forwards within time, which for me, interacting with this work and with Stein's work 80 years later, again, this kind of telescoping of time and of history repeating itself was hair-raising for me.
Yeah, and thinking, please go ahead. Well, I was just thinking, as I said, this idea somehow really resonates with me. For, my entry into Stein was through Tender Buttons. I'm kind of obsessed with it. And non-queer, person of color, and her reach to me in 2024, as I look back on that first reading of Tender Buttons in 2011, and this idea of this iterative influence, it's fascinating to me, actually.
She said, the soothing thing about history is that it repeats itself.
Yes.
Doesn't feel so soothing to 2024, I gotta say.
Yes, it depends.
It depends on your perspective.
Well, she wasn't a fan of soothing. I think that's the...
So any comment anybody else wants to make? We have to wrap it up in about 5 minutes here. Got a couple more? There, great.
For me, I want to say thank you because I don't come from a literary background. I love literature, I read a lot, but you've just broken down all the barriers and opened up a whole new way of looking at literature. So I'm very grateful for your work and your effort and the way you've touched me and the way that you've explained it and engaged me. Thank you very, very, very much. Very profound.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great thank you. I was expecting, I think it's Adam, is that right? Yes. I was expecting you to mention Virginia Woolf, because in terms of time, you mentioned about sculpting time, and of course time in music. But also what I was thinking is these were people who were way ahead of their time. I consider them not just contemporary writers, they're ahead of our contemporary writers. I'm just curious how that lands with you.
Do you want to speak to that?
Well, I would just say, I can't remember the quote, but she said she was of her time, and it was just the rest of the world would need to catch up or something along those lines.
Yeah. The question of being of one's time is certainly something Stein was trying to think about. So there's a couple of things that I might sort of say to that. One is this category of the contemporary, which sort of has come to name a kind of music in a sense. Music that could be 60 years old or 80 years old, but nonetheless is itself concerned with how the audience and the music keeps time together. And that, I think, is very much a part of Stein's poetics and this idea of the continuous present. And once you put that on the table for artists, it becomes very, shall we say, influential and something to think and make with as a concept of, you know, how those two spaces keep time together. So that's one thing that I think of that Stein's been very important for, that sort of line of thinking. The other thing I'll say, just because the Goebbels and the question, I mean, for her, war is very strange because it's when war happens that everything catches up to the present. Something about the intensity of wartime experience, the technological development that seems to happen in wartime, the grouping effect of war seems to require or enforce. It's hard to understand what she's saying in this when she's talking about this, but it seems to bring everything into the present. So that's both exhilarating but also, you know, terrifying.
I'm going to close up, regrettably, but I want to make a comment that I thought would be sort of fit today. Stein, always a quester, her final words before she died. This is the quote. Then what is the question? Thank you.
Thank you, SFU. Thank you, all of you. It was fabulous.